Thank you very much. I have the disadvantage of coming a little bit later in the day, which is a disadvantage when you realize how low octane your paper is compared to the things that came before, first of all. And second of all, when you realize that much of the things, number of the things that you wanted to say have already been in one way or another addressed. However, it did allow me to cut down my introductory remarks, which were intended to provide a context, which I think has already been provided, which is too bad because I was up late into the night drafting it, and at least it seemed at the time both beautiful and moving. With the dram of bourbon next to me, at least. At any rate, okay. So I'll just begin in medias res, as it were. And so, at present, Humanae, Vitae, and Veritatis, Splendor possess a tenuous hold on our attention. I guess that's been stated already too. Regarding the first, we hear that it is visionary and prophetic. But this gesture is rather like the knowing wink younger relatives give each other when grandpa says something inexplicable or out of context. At best, it presents an ideal which would appear to invite our approach asymptotically. It has thereby become classic and safe. For its part, the whole of Veritatis Splendor is ignored as though it did not exist even on this, its 25th anniversary. Pope Benedict once said, I believe, although I don't know where the quotation comes from, that Veritatis Splendor is St. John Paul II's most important encyclical. Perhaps it may be, but it has also become his most invisible one. Yet this treatment, or rather non-treatment, of these two landmark documents seems to have a particular object: obscuring the significance of individual acts, especially as they bear on sexual and conjugal morality. It is this question of the meaning of the individual act, particularly in relation to Humanae Vitae and Veritatis Splendor, that I would like to discuss today. What is the significance of individual acts? Has their time come and gone? Do they continue to be important? If so, why? In order to launch my discussion and to situate it in relation to the current situation, I would like to turn to a recent example that received significant attention, at least on Catholic blogs. I don't know where else, but it is the lecture given by Father Maurizio Chiodi at the Gregorian University almost a year ago, which was published in modified form last January. The original lecture was highly critical of a position taken by Stephen Kampowski and me in an article published in First Things. So I noticed that Father earlier didn't name his professor or the order that was founded in the Baroque era. So I've just named Father Chiodi. My excuse for that is, that of all 5-year-olds, he hit me first, sort of thing. So in his paper, Father Chiodi offered what he called a rereading of Humanae Vitae in light of Amoris Laetitia. In his talk, Chiodi argued that conscience is not reducible to an awareness of oneself, nor to the knowledge of an objective truth, nor to a faculty that applies the moral law, nor to a judgment that tells me what I should do, hic et nunc. Rather, he tells us, I'm quoting here, conscience coincides with the totality of the self-person in its passive and active valence, end quote. Chiodi then speaks of a constitutive link between conscience, act, norm, and discernment. This means, he says, that experiences of a good life with their original relational quality are inscribed in the conscience as the passive and affective form of its temporal and narrative identity. So importantly, He's saying that conscience is object. The most important thing, it seems to me, in his article is his statement that conscience's object is not the norm, but the act itself in all of its contextual complexity. Right? This is what he's getting at. In essence, then, norms are guides to action. They are not. They cannot replace the conscience's task of discernment of context and personal narrative. They certainly cannot stand as timeless ahistorical truths. Conscience, therefore, seems most especially to be the power of discernment itself, a power that should not be short-circuited by mechanical and deductive applications of norms. From this anthropological, and now I'm quoting, from this anthropological and Christological perspective, Quixote explains, moral norms are not reducible to rational objectivity. They are inscribed in the human story, understood as a history of graces and salvation. If Humanae Vitae is to have any bearing at all, then, this is me summarizing, it will not be in relation to paragraph 11's each and every act. I had sort of set that up in the lopped off part of the introduction, but paragraph 11 being the one that talks about each and every act being ordained to procreation. The wisdom of Humanae Vitae, says Quixote, is to have recalled in the line of Gaudium Spes the inseparable link between sexuality and generation. This is the fundamental anthropological lesson that we must draw from it. This inseparable link offers the anthropological basis for the child to know that he has come into the world in a sexual relationship between a man and a woman, a meeting that has a free, intentional, and responsible quality. So it is irreducible to a casual or fortuitous event. As a result, end quote, as a result, Humanae Vitae should not or should no longer be understood to propose a decontextualized act and norm. Rather, it proposes the standard of responsibility, which is itself necessary if the child is not to understand himself as the result of a casual and fortuitous event. This responsibility cannot be reduced to obedience to biological laws, he tells us. Therefore, he concludes, technological methods can, under certain circumstances, safeguard the responsible character of the sexual act. They cannot be rejected a priori when the birth of a child is at stake, because they are a form of action and as such require discernment on the basis of moral criteria reducible to a syllogistic deductive application of norms. That was a long quote. The longer version of this paper, which thankfully you're not getting, even though what you are getting still is kind of longish, I talk about this concept of responsibility and what it would mean for example, for Quixote, compared to what I think it ought to mean, right? The way we ought to understand it in Humanae Vitae, John Paul II. But just intrinsically, what is responsibility in a right view of the cosmos, I guess. Okay, so the overall argument of Quixote is fuzzy and presents a labyrinth of questions. But my purpose is not to respond to every feature of it. Rather, I would like only to examine his treatment of the individual human act in its relation to moral truth. Of course, Father Quixote is correct to object to moral norms that exist somehow, somewhere, at a great distance from actual concrete situations, but which are then simply applied deductively to those situations. He is also correct, of course, to point to the anthropological and ethical sense of the encyclical's inseparability doctrine rather than to biological laws. Astonishingly, however, the primary elements of his argument were already offered and argued by the detractors of Humanae Vitae in its immediate aftermath. So in effect, I guess, there's nothing new under the sun here. But more importantly, they were also already addressed by Veritatis Splendor, which Quixote does not even mention. Again, the invisibility of it and all. So let's review just a couple of important points. First off, and most important, like Quixote, the early advocates for change in the perennial doctrine of contraception attempted to shift inseparability away from individual acts and onto the idea of marriage as a whole. So the marriage as a whole should be, everyone agrees, generously fecund. But as long as that's the case, then individual acts themselves, in essence, don't really matter. And so therein is sort of the issue. And then I go on and I gripe a little bit here, which I'll skip, about how Veritatis Splendor addressed these things. So why isn't it engaged? And the main problem here, and which is already pointed out by Archbishop Denoya and also by Dr. D.L. Schindler in his paper, is this problem I would characterize as this extrinsicism, which you see. My point is that you see it replicated again in Quixote very, very clearly. I mean, so in other words, what's happened here then is the conditions for the application of norms has been fidgeted with, right? Has been fiddled with, but that doesn't eliminate the problem of the extrinsicism itself, right? You simply in other words, you resist this deductive application of what is taken then as an abstract and extrinsic norm, sort of the just immediate application deductively, and then you fidget with the terms of the application, but you haven't gotten rid of the extrinsicism. Okay. So then in large part, it must be granted that Veritatis Splendor. So I want to turn to Veritatis Splendor and look at what it says. It must be granted that its starting point seems inauspicious given Quixote's precise criticisms. For in discussing human action, the forgotten encyclical, I'll just call it that, the forgotten encyclical, draws on the traditional concept of the moral object. Hence, it would seem at first glance merely to repropose the sort of nominalistic extrinsicism to which Quixote and his predecessors rightly objected. Nevertheless, it is my goal to vindicate this starting point in what follows. Okay, so I'm defending Veritatis Splendor, I guess. Now, the first thing to notice is that the forgotten encyclical does not present moral evaluation or conscience as a comparison of the moral object to an external norm. Rather, the question is whether the object is the sort of activity that can be reconciled with love for God and neighbor. The central point, in fact, Veritatis Splendor does focus on the act itself, right? And the question is, what sorts of acts can be reconciled with God and neighbor? The central point then is not that an imposed and external law must be obeyed, but rather that our actions have infinite significance because they have an intrinsic intelligibility and because they order us or disorder us in relation to those whom we ought to love. When we act, we are implicitly adhering to some conception of reality as a whole, or to put it in classical terms, to some idea of what our final end is. This is the drama or risk of action. It means that in a real way, when we act, everything that we are is at stake. If the moral object then plays a decisive role in this ordering or disordering, what is it? John Paul characterizes this notoriously slippery concept as a chosen kind of behavior, but this formulation may have managed only to defer the question rather than to answer it. To understand this latter phrase, we are referred to question 18, Article 6 of the Prima Secundae. There, Thomas famously makes a distinction between two parts or aspects of human act, the interior act of the will and the external act. By internal act of the will, Thomas means nothing other than the act of the will itself as a power or faculty. By external act, he means that which is proposed by reason to the will for choice. Now, Thomas speaks of the internal act of the will as the formal cause and the exterior act as the material cause of the act as a whole. For this reason, we might think that the act is specified as a kind of behavior exclusively by the internal act. This assumption, however, would be wrong. Rather, each of these two principles of a single moral object partly specifies the whole act. This is why Thomas speaks over the next two questions of the contributions of both the internal act of the will and the external act to the good or evil of a moral object or act as a whole. The external object itself is not simply the material or physical movements of the powers of the soul. It is not just, for example, the movement of a set of muscles. But to revert to Veritatis Splendor's language, it is a kind of behavior, which is proposed to the will as a good apprehended and ordained by reason. How do we know about the goodness or malice of the external act itself, and therefore its contribution to the goodness or badness of the human act as a whole? On the basis of its being about due matter and circumstances, Thomas tells us. It is important to note in this phrase that Thomas speaks of the external act as materia debita rather than as, say, materia prima. If the external act including its natural or physical structure is considered materia, it is certainly not formless or pure potency. Apprehensio implies that something precedes the act of reason itself. What would this something be? It is a good to be proposed to the will, but it is also intelligible as a certain kind of behavior which entails all of the elements that make the action possible and concrete. The dueness of the matter must be taken to include precisely the intelligible structure of the act, but this intelligible structure must take up those elements, including those bodily elements that make it intelligible as an act. It is this structure in its givenness that is apprehended and evaluated for dueness. Just as surely ordinatio refers to an inherent ordination of what is apprehended and not only to the constituting work of the moral subject. Each of these, the inherent intelligibility or form and the inherent ordination or teleology, inwardly structures practical reason and choice themselves. Again, they are not just the wills or practical reasons, formless material from which anything can be made. Recall in this light the famous passage from Veritatis Splendor, which forms the title of our conference. The operative words are discovers and anticipatory signs. One discovers the anticipatory signs because they are present in the body and its acts from the beginning. They are inscribed in the body by the very fact of creation. They structure action and, in that sense, would seem to be part of the sort of dueness we would look for in a human action, particularly the conjugal act. To take a larger view for a moment, both our saints, Thomas and John Paul, take for granted basic, even obvious elements of any human action. Human beings are creatures, and therefore we do not give ourselves to ourselves, nor do we give ourselves our world. Human action is only and can only be a taking up of what is given, both that which is internal to us, so acting brings us to a focal point in a way, as has been expressed by a number of thinkers, and what is given in our world. I cannot walk without traction, gravity, and the internal powers of movement. I cannot speak without air, language, vocal cords, interlocutors, a culture, and the powers of speech and reason. We cannot be ourselves without a very complex social fabric of parents, relatives, friends, enemies, and any number of other sorts of relations, distant and close. All of these, radically speaking, are part of the larger intelligibility of action, even if they are normally tacit. If one of them is missing, suddenly the absence begins to undermine intelligibility. For example, in the misnomer, spacewalking. Spacewalking is, of course, intelligible, but not as a kind of walking. Spacewalking possesses only the faintest analogy to actual walking. Even more fundamentally, none of these sources of intelligibility is possible without the created order as created and therefore as ordered both from and back to God. Of course, human action does possess a genuine originality, but it is always the originality of a creature. It is never ex nihilo originality. It is an originality that is always embedded and supported by the larger givenness of reality. We could take Mary as the model of our purely human action. Just as Mary's yes must truly be her own yes, nevertheless, it is also purely a gift embedded both in her nature and unique invitation by God in its correlative graces. In addition to receiving special graces, Mary must be God's creature, must be a woman, must be rational, must be free, and so forth, if she is to say yes at all. These really very obvious truths are especially evident and important with regard to the conjugal act. It is only possible insofar as it takes up an order given in the sexually differentiated bodies of the spouses. The spouses cannot give themselves this order, but they only assume it and its structure into their act. For example, and obviously, the spouses do not give themselves either their masculinity or femininity, nor do they give themselves the correlative nature of those two realities. Of course, all this means that there is a kind of a predetermined objectivity to the conjugal act that makes it to be what it is. In this, the conjugal act is unlike, for example, lifting one's arm, because lifting one's arm can mean or signify any number of things. Nor, on the other hand, is it like, say, hailing a friend. Since, while hailing a friend has a set meaning or significance, it can be accomplished in any number of ways. The conjugal act is different from either of these, since it possesses both a fixed bodily structural element and an inherent objective meaning or signification. In a paper given just before his election to the papacy, Karol Wojtyła made precisely this point, and I'm going to summarize this paragraph. But actually, I guess I can't. Sorry, I can't hold myself back. In his paper, Wojtyła first emphasizes that conjugal act is a kind of co-act, or as he puts it, action cooperation. The conjugal act cannot occur at all without the cooperation or co-action of the spouses. This means that the acting subject of the conjugal act is never simply an individual agent or even two individual agents acting in tandem. The action is only possible as the action of the two together and only by means of the unique character of each. Their differentiation into man and woman, husband and wife. In a real way, the action is that of the two as a unity. Husband and wife are not, or should not be, alone together in their embrace. Objectively, or of its nature, Wojtyła tells us, the conjugal act signifies the unitive and procreative goods, according to laws inscribed in the very being of man and woman. This, what is important is the idea of objective meaning. That is to say, a meaning or significance that is already present in the kind of behavior that is the conjugal act. Apparently then, do-ness, if what we're looking for in terms of what makes an act a good act or makes it to be a conjugal act, do-ness will refer in part to this objective meaning. Wojtyła goes on to say that what is important is a harmony between the choices of the spouses and the objective meaning. Their subjective disposition must, if it is to be honest, be in harmony with the objective meaning, that is to say, as unitive and procreative. Standard English translations of Humanae Vitae speak of the inseparable meanings of the conjugal act, and we in America have therefore naturally grown accustomed to speaking of the teaching in that way. But Wojtyła's text draws on the Latin or Italian versions of Humanae Vitae, which more literally refer to the conjugal act's signification. So that has been used already today. While I guess meaning is an adequate translation of signification or significationem, it fails to indicate any connection to the idea of sign or signum. That is to say, it fails to convey the idea that the two significations stand for something greater than themselves. As such, the standard English translation fails to convey the echo of a symbolic order. Clearly, this latter sense is closely related to Wojtyła's nearly concurrent work on the Wednesday Catechesis on Human Love. And here I will skip. What I want to just point to is what everyone already sort of knows, this idea of the action as a kind of a rereading of the truth of the person and necessity then, and it's the relationship of this idea of the sacramental order that's visible in the body and so on. Okay, so one way to speak of creaturely action then is to say that we are always rereading our world in its symbolically and sacramentally saturated meaning. In order to act at all, we need to know and understand what is intelligible and given in that order. The point is very much like Ratzinger's when he says in the Introduction to Christianity that for the medieval mind, human thinking is always a rethinking of the original thought of the creator spiritus, who creates by thinking things into being. Clearly fundamental to this symbolism is John Paul's characteristic teaching on the body as a sacrament or a sign of the person who bears within himself the structure of being, a gift to the world, himself, and others. So then, what can we say about conjugality? So what I've been getting at then is conjugality as what is present and what is taken up. It's possible, but is it possible to specify more completely what is meant by the symbolic order inscribed in the conjugal act? Certainly, and at a minimum, it presupposes conjugality, which itself presupposes the correlative order of the man and woman, which is embedded at the heart of God's creative act. In the order of intention, what comes last, the end, is the first principle, the most important good. It is the purpose for which all else is done. In God's creative act, man and woman are the last to be made. Actually, come to think of it, the woman is absolutely the last to be made. The creation story, then, as John Paul especially emphasized, can be very naturally read as a story about marriage. At the same time, the first marriage is a type of what is to come. These reflections suggest something important about the conjugal act. As I just said, if it is to be a conjugal act, it must possess the quality of conjugality. Now, if it is true that the order expressed in the body as sexually differentiated into male and female constitutes in its very structure an anticipatory sign, then the spouses can only assume this sign or symbolic meaning into their act insofar as their act really is a conjugal act. To be conjugal, then, it must be truly unitive, as the very meaning of the word implies. This means that it must be in a real way, recapitulate the meaning of or form the bond, which is marriage itself. To put it back into our original terms, its due-ness will at least depend on this. If we ask about that of which the conjugal act is symbolic, then we will have to say it is first and foremost symbolic of the marriage of which it is a part and an expression. To be conjugal, it needs to be an expression or a kind of crystallization of marriage. Put in another way, for an act to be conjugal, it must be the sort of act that would consummate a marriage if it were the first such act, since consummation brings sacramental marriage to its fulfillment or completion, as the word signifies and as the Catechism says, by making the bond or the unitive conjugal mutual belonging absolutely indissoluble. If a sexual act lacks this, then it lacks conjugality altogether. This means that it must express the bond and fruitfulness of marriage. Ultimately, the conjugal act's due-ness, its being about due matter, is going to depend on its actually possessing this character of conjugality. Due-ness, then, will necessarily involve some consideration of the act in relation to its ability to carry this sign or to be the kind of real symbol of the whole of marriage. Notice that in this way a central truth of the principle of totality is preserved, but not at the cost of the meaningfulness or the drama of the individual acts, but rather as an affirmation at the heart of the individual act. The individual act is a microcosm of the whole of which it is a part. A crucial question arises at this point. One ambiguity of Humanae Vitae itself is that it leaves the nature of the inseparable connection of the two meanings, unity and fruitfulness, ambiguous. Is it that the two meanings are only morally inseparable? That is to say, they may be separated, but it is immoral to do so. So I would take it, for example, that that would be the position of Germain Grisez, right? That it's a moral inseparability. Or are they ontologically inseparable? That is to say, they may not be separated except at the cost of evacuating both meanings or destroying or defacing both. And I think Professor Walker basically said that in his fabulous presentation earlier. So the second ontological interpretation better fits, I think, the scant evidence in the text of Humanae Vitae, although evidence of the first is also present. Here it is helpful, I think, to look at the question against the backdrop of Gaudium et Spes' teaching, which had avoided discussion of the traditional hierarchy of ends, but instead was satisfied simply to refer both to love and procreation. If conjugality requires that the conjugal act express or symbolically embody the marriage itself, if it is a fragment containing an image of the whole, then it is helpful to ask ourselves about what that whole marriage itself is. Theological debate about the promulgation, between the promulgation of Casti Connubii and the start of the council, saw a certain tension between love and procreation. Emphasis on love tended to be seen as a diminishment of the importance of the procreative end, while emphasis on the procreative end appeared to deny the centrality of love. The period following the council saw this dualism continue in a new form. Some argued that the council fathers had elevated love to an end parallel to procreation. If marriage now has two ends, they may come into conflict, it was said. Where such a conflict occurs, a couple would have to choose between them. Naturally, in such situations, the spiritual good of love would take precedence over the merely biological end of procreation. In effect, then, we have an overturning of the traditional priority of the procreative end. We can see an echo of this debate, perhaps, in Quixote's presentation. Certainly, such an interpretation runs contrary to the Council Fathers' purpose, as is verified by the reminder that there can be no real contradiction between procreation and authentic conjugal love. Indeed, a careful reading of Gaudium et Spes quickly shows that the Council Fathers did not make love and procreation parallel ends. Rather, they consistently refer to love in relation to the nature of the married relationship or covenant itself. And while it is true that they avoid the language of end, they consistently use surrogate teleological language. For example, they say that marriage is ordained to procreation, or they say that procreation is marriage's crowning jewel. In effect, then, they associate love with what marriage is, that is to say, as especially pertaining to its formal cause, and they treat procreation as what marriage is ordained to, that is to say, as its final cause. They suggest, in other words, that love is not the end, but pertains to the form of marriage. The basis for this understanding becomes more evident, perhaps, when we consider that consent is itself an act of binding or uniting. It initiates a life of shared belonging. It brings into being the indissoluble bond, which is the objective realization of this mutual belonging. It is the foundational act of conjugal love, a love that the Council Fathers tell us is caught up into divine love. The bond and the institution that result then are the objective and indissoluble oneness of the spouses. We might say that marriage itself is the instantiation of the objective bond of love. It instantiates love as an objective and abiding union of spouses. So what do we make of this? Important to note is not simply that marriage is ordained by nature to the end of procreation, but that that marriage is ordained to the end of procreation, but that married love is so ordained. The child, in other words, is an expression of the very married bond itself, which is the objective and permanent instantiation of the union, mutual belonging, or in a word, love. If so, then the relationship between love and procreation is easier to work out. The relationship is not one of parallel ends, rather the relationship is organic. It is the relationship of form and finality. If love, then, is the form of marriage and procreation, its end, we can see the relation between them as organic, hylomorphic oneness, just as form and finality are principles of the oneness of a single being. conjugal love and procreation cannot possibly find themselves in opposition or competition because they are related organically as form and finality. Interestingly, it remains perfectly possible, according to this logic, to think of both procreation and love as ends of marriage, but now in a more nuanced way. The procreative end is the end that, strictly speaking, in the child transcends the marriage bond as such. Love, on the other hand, is an end in the sense that it is the perfection of the form of something. It is the integral, or in this sense, it is the integral or intrinsic end. It is the imminent good of the marriage as such. What we find then is in fact an enrichment of the traditional language of object and do-ness as it pertains to the conjugal act. If the conjugal act works as a real symbol of the marriage itself, if it is a fragment symbolizing the whole, then its characteristic of conjugality will need to recapitulate and express the organic unicity of love and procreation in marriage. And indeed, this is precisely what Humanae Vitae's two significations or meanings do. In fact, if we ask about the object of the conjugal act, if we ask what the object of the conjugal act is, we have to say that it is, or more strongly, that it must be the union of the spouses. Again, this is implied by the very meaning of conjugality. But if it is to be conjugal, if it is to express conjugality, then it must be simultaneously and necessarily ordered to the procreative end, which is the end proper to this kind of union or love. It must maintain the organic unicity of the formal unitive loving cause and the final fruitful procreative cause. At least tacitly then, its object must also contain an openness to the fruit that is proper to that union, but which can only be received. This helps us to see that the two significations are not two parallel or extrinsically related meanings brought together in one act, any more than love and procreation are simply two parallel but extrinsically related ends of marriage. Rather, the relation of the unitive and procreative meanings or significances of the conjugal act directly reflects and symbolically makes present the objective instantiation of love in the marital bond with its ordination to the fruitfulness of the child. The unitive and procreative meanings of the conjugal act, therefore, organically or hylomorphically relate. To destroy one is to destroy the whole in a way that is analogous to the destruction of a substantial being. Contraception, and my purpose here is not to offer, sort of like a full-fledged proof of the wrongfulness of contraception or anything, but I'll just say this. Contraception is complex because it is the intervention of one act onto another. It is in effect doing something to the sexual act to deprive it of its procreative meaning and end. But this is to choose to separate what are in fact hylomorphically related causal principles of an organic whole, necessary in their organic unicity to embody symbolically the whole that is marriage. This choice is made congruently with the choice of the sexual act or a series of sexual acts, and therefore also reshapes the nature of that choice or set of choices to have sexual relations. Notice I'm not talking about conjugal act anymore, right? I'm saying sexual union or sexual act. It means, and actually I agree with the earlier point that maybe it's not even fully sexual, right? I think that's brilliant. I like that. Okay, so it means that the choice to engage in the sexual act is a choice for an act unable to bear in itself the fullness of the symbolic order. Contraception therefore entails setting one's will against the meaning or ratio conjugality in its fullness. In effect, then, contracepted sexual acts can only be parasitic on that order. They therefore also are a choice of undue matter for the love proper to marriage. We can easily see that a contracepted act is quite different from an act that is naturally infertile, precisely because contraception is an additional but related action specifically chosen for the sake of suppressing the meaning, conjugality, and in its amplitude, which must include the organic unicity of the symbolic whole. A naturally infertile act continues to be ordered to procreation because the sense of order is teleological and not efficient or mechanical functionality. What is chosen in this latter case, therefore, is precisely an act that is per se apt for generation. So my conclusion. I better make this conclusion short. Crucial here is that for Humanae, Vitae, and Veritatis Splendor, the objective meaning or symbolic character of the conjugal act is not outside of the moral subject. This is where we began, right? So this idea of simply an extrinsic norm is not what the argument that is presented in either document makes. So crucial here is that Humanae, Vitae, and Veritatis Splendor, neither of them offers this extrinsic norm. The objective meaning or symbolic character of the conjugal act is not outside the moral subject. To emphasize objectivity does not translate into a meta-ethics in which we are viewed as subjects looking passively outward at or to our bodies and actions for normative content. John Paul has not therefore proposed what has rightly been called a dualistic fallacy, according to which the subject's freedom confronts an effectively external legal standard represented by the body. If the moral truth written in the body and its acts is viewed only as a legal limit that an otherwise indifferent freedom must confront and then choose either to obey or disregard, then the body and bodily action have implicitly been reduced to a kind of moral res extensa, impressed with God's binding will and law. Violation of the norm would indicate legal guilt, but the conceptual framework would fail to capture the interior contradiction experienced at the deepest level of moral subjectivity. It would fail to capture the fragmentation of the moral subject, him or herself. Rather, the rereading to which John Paul points is a primitive awareness of our nature and creatureliness, but in the service of a simple moral, not in the service of a simple moral limit, but as an expression of the truth of the moral subject, his desires and destiny, and in relation to all others and the world, and finally his destiny in God. It is in this sense that the moral subject discovers in the body the anticipatory signs. Hence, the symbolic body does not impose, but discloses who and what the spouses are, reflected in their spousal relationship in the most fundamental desires and destiny. When actors' choices in fact relate to the objective meaning of their co-action in a contradictory or vitiating way, which occurs when some further act, such as the act of contraception, overlays the sexual act, or when a sexual act which of its nature signifies conjugality is not in fact a realization of conjugality, such as relations outside marriage, or when action rejects the order given in creation, such as a homosexual act, we are confronted with inauthenticity, a kind of rejection of the objective meaning of the body and action, their truth and good. More completely, we are confronted by an implicit rejection of both the fatherhood of God and the invitation of the bridegroom. But again, this rejection is not that of an abstract law written in the body and viewed as other or separate from the moral actor's freedom. Rather, such a rejection of objectivity can only be the subject's despairing rejection of himself. Nothing here implies an imposition of a separate set of general moral truths on human freedom, the positivistic imposition of God's will, since the symbolism of the body is a visible sign or manifestation of the authentic destiny and identity of the person himself. They therefore signify an authentic fulfillment in love. To call this an imposition on freedom would be like calling the interior determination of man towards his end in God alienating, which begins to sound more like the words of the serpent than the Father. Thank you.